Interested in trying to analyze the relationship of disease incidence with weather.
So you both independently?
We both independently had the same. This was in the sort of late 50s, beginning of the 60s. And Clive said, well, why don't we all, Clive said, I can't work with you only because I've been approached by Max and I promised to help him. So why don't we, the easiest thing is for us three to work together. And so we got together and we agreed that it was far wiser for us to just work together. I had certain data, Max had certain data, and Clive was responsible for the analysis. And so we actually, that's how I got to know Max Wilson. And we published, I think, a couple of papers on the relationship. We were able to disentangle, through the method that Clive had developed, the influence of individual weather variables on the seasonal incidence of respiratory disease. That's how we got together.
Right. And that was in the early 60s?
This was in the early 60s, and I suppose some of the work I did before I went to the States, some of the work I did when I came back in 62, and we published, I think, in 63, 64.
Right.
It was I've always used it as the, with the using of computer, we were able to do an analysis which took about 3 weeks of computing time, which would have taken approximately 3 to 4 years to do with the hand machine.
And now it takes 3 seconds.
Oh, now it's a common method and everything. It was essentially comparing, what we were doing was comparing a cold winter with a warm winter, a cold summer with a warm summer, a wet summer, and so on. So we were able to disentangle each of the components of the weather.
Shall we go through the questions?
Please do, and probably not irrelevant, because we weren't sitting here if that was irrelevant. If that didn't happen, you probably wouldn't have met.
No.
We wouldn't have had this story.
We've written that you've been mentioned several times in the Principles and Practice of Screening for Disease, and one which I think might be a reference to respiratory disease is
the early 60s. I think it's important to recognize the milieu about screening, which is developing in the early 60s and eventually eventuating in various publications. Very important to appreciate that the real progenitors of screening were, I suppose, well, there are lots of histories of screening, but I mean, in America was very important. And there was an act passed, the Chronic Disease Act, by the Americans, which in fact suggested that everybody should be tested and screened. In, I think, the year that it was passed was 1957, and the Chronic Disease Commission was created as to supervise that, and a man called Lester Breslow.
He was American, wasn't he? Was he American?
Yes, he was the I suppose the equivalent of the medical officer of health for California. He was the director of public health of California. He was the chair of that commission. Now, in the early 60s, I came back from the United States in 1962 to St. Thomas's and started the department, well, started a unit, then a department there. This was at the time that the Department of Health recognized that it would need to have a better research capability than it had. And this is largely the work due to the influence of the Chief Medical Officer, George Godber. Sir George Godber was, in my view, the best Chief Medical Officer that this country has had since John Simone in the 19th century. There is if you want to look it up, there is actually an account of the Chief Medical Officers by Donaldson and I don't remember her name. She's a medical, Sally Sheard, and Sally Sheard, S-H-E-A-R-D, who describes briefly the biography of each of the Chief Medical Officers. Max had been a medical officer in the tea plantations in India and had come back to this country, worked at University College, and he went to work at the Department of Health as a medical officer. Because of his research inclinations, George Godber relied upon him to look at research and look at research topics. In the beginning of the 60s, there was a realization that early diagnosis and screening could begin to play a role in the control of chronic diseases, and the reason for that was largely because of the experience with MMR, with X-rays in the control of tuberculosis. Max was identified by George Godber to go to the United States in order to find out what they were doing and what they were thinking of. He came to talk, because I was recently returned from the United States. I'd spent just over a year at Johns Hopkins. I'd traveled quite widely in the United States and visited quite a large number of different places like California.
And you'd kept in touch, had you?
Yes,
you
we
and
had.
Max,
Yes,
because you knew each other before
yes,
you went to
we
the
were
USA.
Yes, but I mean, he came to talk to me about who he should go
When
and
you
see.
returned.
When I returned in 1962. I think he went in 1963 or 64. I can't remember. He went on a trip which lasted about 3 to 4 months on a very wide-ranging exploration to find out what screening, if any, was being done in the United States. And I largely helped him in providing him with contacts from people I knew there. When he came back, Godber gave him that as one of his tasks, and it was accepted by the Department of Health that we needed to develop screening. At that time, the only screening really that was still being done was phenylketonuria. I can't remember when it was introduced. But
Well, I can tell you. It was introduced in most parts of definitely England as a urine test in the early
Right.
60s.
That's right. It was.
But it was discovered, of course, as Peter knows.
Well,
You,
since a year since about 3 or 4 years now, yes.
the urine test failed to detect all cases, and it took weeks before the urine test was positive. So that particular screening test, which was done by health visitors,
right.
lots and lots of health visitors, failed because it didn't detect the disease early enough. It was done by a myriad of different health professionals, some of whom apocryphal tales go on to say that they misread the stick test. I don't know how true that is. And of course, by then, Guthrie had developed his bacterial inhibition assay, and so in 1969 was the date for introduction in England, but Scotland had started in 1967. They always feel superior to England because it started 2 years earlier.
Well, it was one of the tests which had never been evaluated. It's the only screening test which is universally used and has never actually ever been evaluated properly.
Do you think it would fail in any
No,
areas
no.
of...
But there was no way that the government could stop it, or the NHS could stop it.
No.
It was so commonly done, but it is the one universally used screening procedure in this country that has never gone through a proper evaluation. Now, Wilson recognised this.
If I just may shortly interrupt, would it be fair to say that Goldberg was really the push behind getting more involved in screening?
No.
Or this was really Wilson's doing? No.
Neither Goldberg nor Wilson are the real drivers. It was the person really that has to be given credit is George Goldberg.
Oh, sorry, I mixed up Goldberg.
Goldberg is
I meant Goldberg. So he was
Goldberg was the driving force behind it all. But he was very much in the background. He didn't do any of the... but he recognized...
He had the foresight and the insight.
He had the vision to see that.
Yes.
And he stimulated a variety of individuals and groups to become interested. Now, one of the groups... Sorry.
Well, if he was doing that and he was the chief medical officer, I'm not really acquainted with the situation in the UK back then. Was he autonomous in that, or was he heavily supported, for instance, by the Minister of Health or the Department of Health, or was he autonomous? Was it his doing and his thinking?
George was a very remarkable man. I knew him quite well.
It's already not, so I guess.
He was very much his own person. He had he had enormous presence. He was about 6 foot, 6'2" or so, and he had lost one eye and wore a monocle. Very distinguished looking. He had started in public health before the war. He had been responsible, he was involved in many of the original development of the various procedures in developing the National Health Service since before the 1939 war, and its implementation after the war. He was after the war he was, I think, Deputy Chief Medical Officer. He'd been responsible for a variety of regional activities during the war and making sure there was proper regional distribution of hospital care for the country as a whole and to cope with all the casualties that were envisaged.
So he
I can show you, I hope I can find, sorry, I haven't looked at
I almost distillate from your answer that the Ministry of Health was really happy to have him. And
yes,
and
he was very much, let's see if I can show you his photograph.
Ah, yes. Taken from the side where you can only just tell he's lost the side.
That's right.
And he has a monocle.
Yes.
He came, it's also important to realize he came over, the Godbers were a very well recognized family. One brother became a minister, another brother became police commissioner in Hong Kong. He was later had up the corruption in that job. But so he came from a very old, distinguished family. He was very much the one with the most progressive views in among. I would suspect. I mean, I didn't know any of the others except in terms of their natural. But anyway, Wilson was Godber had Godber. Your question is important, and I don't know how to answer it. I think the simple answer is that he still had enormous power as chief medical officer because he was respected by politicians of all sides, and because he was highly respected by by members of the medical profession. For example, there's a bust of him in the Royal College of Physicians, which is quite unusual because Royal College of Physicians usually doesn't like chief medical officers. Certainly none of his successors have had similar influence, power, imagination, or ability.
Yeah.
Since that time. And
Well, I
but
do
his
think that
predecessor was quite different. His predecessor was far less effective, partly because my boss, for example, never got on with John Charles, his predecessor. Got on very well with George Godber. George Godber, for example, was the driving force of introducing anti-smoking measures.
Sorry.
Anti-smoking measures.
Oh, they are.
George was the driving force behind getting politicians and others to ban smoking and to show that smoking was harmful.
And that must have been in.
This was in this. This was in the yes from the in the 50s already.
Already.
Yes. It was not very popular in political circles because, of course, for example, the Minister of Health, when he gave his the first talk about the dangers of smoking, was sitting there smoking his own cigarette. There are many stories, but anyway, Wilson was used by Godber as a medical researcher to develop areas that were considered to be important for the Department of Health in the future. Simultaneously, at the same time, around the late 1960s, the Department of Health realized that they needed research capability. And they had an in-house research unit, which was not considered to be of any particular stature or being very good. And of course, being inside, nobody trusted what they said. And so Godber recognized that he needed to develop a capability of contracting or developing research being done outside. He recruited as his deputy a man called Dick Cohen. Now, Dick Cohen was the third secretary of the Medical Research Council. He had become fed up with the Medical Research Council because the council was only interested in pure research and wasn't really very interested in the application of research. And so he was very easily, well, I suspect, quite easily persuaded to transfer to the Department of Health, where he became the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And there was a triumvirate of Godber, Cohen, and Wilson, who were interested in the development of a modern health service and developing a research capability.
So for Cohen it was an ability to move towards applied medicine much more than
Yes.
medical research, fundamental medical
Yes,
research.
it rather than, I have my most recent book that I published last year, is this, in which I actually do describe the development of research in this country. If you can have that as a, one of my, it's very expensive if you buy it, but you can have that.
We can have it.
Yes, you can have
Thank
that.
you very much indeed.
Read it, read the whole full history of it at the time. Now, I was at St. Thomas's, and I wanted to develop I was a clinician and had become really learned epidemiology by working with a man called Bradford Hill, who's the professor of medical statistics at London School of Hygiene, Donald Reed, who's the professor of epidemiology, and Richard Doll, who's also there.
Is that the name associated with smoking?
Yes.
Richard Doll?
Yes, wrongly, it was Hill. He was the research assistant.
Younger. So that was very good. And I put a link to your biography, and also a link to, because you can get the monograph online.
Yes.
With a link.
Yes, she asked me to write it. Write the biography.
Oh right,
from
yes.
the College of Physicians.
Right, yes.
Monk's Row.
The Monk's Roll, yes. I was surprised to. I thought, oh, I don't know why it's called that. Do you know why?
No idea.
It's one of those ancient historical things. You got the impression, didn't you, Peter, that the living relatives of Darwin were not familiar with the importance of his work? Is that what you were saying?
Oh no.
No, well, what I said is that what I suggested, I think, was that just after the publication of the work of Darwin, well, there wasn't a keen idea about how impressive the work really was. And related to that, I put down one of the questions we had. Did anybody realize back at that time, 1968, when the monograph came out, that this was really very important work, which would become very significant in decades to come?
I think that those of us in the field all thought it was very important. I think it was people like Tom Whitehead, Tom McEwen, and they did, but outside, I doubt it.
Do you have any recollection of how it was presented? We of course don't know how WHO paper was published at that time.
Yes,
But
how
was
did-
there some
I don't know how it got
since he
spread.
worked alone on it? Maybe at one point he put the last exclamation mark and said, "Okay, this is done now." And he handed in the work, and it became printed, and that's
Almost
it.
certainly he had to go to Geneva, and he wasn't
Present.
allowed out of Geneva until he'd finished. That
Oh,
is
so he
what
stayed
WHO.
there the whole time.
That's what WHO normally did.
Oh,
That they
And he was-
insist that you do not take the work home.
I
That you
see.
had to do it while you were in Geneva.
and presumably Jungner must have needed
Obviously,
to be there
so
too.
they were there together.
That can be
yes.
quite difficult, especially in those days, because there's 200 or more references.
But there's very good library. WHO had a superb library.
Ah, okay. So they could perhaps have done
At
it.
that time, I'm
yes.
sorry, this is back in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Okay, so let me get this straight. So they went there. It was published in 1968. Did they go in 67 together for a
Probably.
few months?
Probably. I don't
Well
know when it
prepared,
was
of
out.
course, because
Huh?
they well prepared, of course. They had a scheme.
Yes, I mean,
They have to,
yes.
because it's 5
And you
chapters.
went on your own, you didn't take your family for this period of time.
Could if you wanted to,
Right.
usually.
Do you have the idea that Wilson and Jungner really worked together on this?
I have no idea. I never met you, so I don't know.
No. And Wilson never shared any of his experience in Geneva with you in the way that he said, okay,
Not
we
really.
went to dinner then, and then
No,
we worked
no.
for a week. We went sailing on the lake in the weekends. And I can imagine. Or went climbing, maybe. I don't know whether he was a climber.
Yeah.
I mean, it is possible, I suppose, that it was written in separate sections by the two of them, because
I would suspect it was. Each of them wrote one particular bit.
because there certainly is something talking about computerization.
Yeah, but that really was the last chapter, wasn't it?
Was it the last chapter?
Or at least Jungner's references were.
Methodological trends in screening, and then you just talk about automation, paper strip. Yes, it has the. It has the this. You're right. This has the hand of a laboratorian. Auto analyzers. Yes.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah. Well, we have to come back to that later, especially in automation, since we're from laboratory, or at least I am. I want to know something about that as well. But going back to, so apparently he couldn't leave Geneva because of WHO that said, you better finish this before you leave. But then when the work was done and when the monograph was ready, was presented in any way at a
Oh,
congress
gosh,
or
I mean, the WHO had an editorial committee and had a publishing arm. Still has.
they did it, yeah.
And they would have published it. I don't know how. I don't know the arrangements for that series. I know the arrangements for other bits of WHO. I mean,
So I wonder how people learnt that the monograph existed.
Absolutely, yeah.
oh, they
How did somebody in a neonatal screening laboratory
well,
discover that it was available?
They circulate flyers about in the same way as any publisher does.
So they perhaps would circulate through the Department of Health
Probably.
to
yes.
hospitals?
Yes.
I mean, unfortunately, the head of the screening laboratory that I used to work at, when this would have come out, unfortunately he's dead, so I can't ask him.
No, but that really is something that would be my question as well. At what point did you?
I've got an example, one that I published with WHO here, they're all declared.
But how did the work come back? So it was finished, and then it was published that there is a new publication on criteria, and everybody was waiting on this piece of Wilson and Jung providing those criteria. How was it received? At what point did you, as a scientist or as a person that is active in health policy, notice that these criteria these principles are now available and they are used and applied?
I don't think that I can't answer that. I'm the wrong person to ask that. But remember that there were that in fact there were a series of different criteria which were published about this by different groups. This was not novel. I mean,
so the 10 criteria were not novel.
not really.
So it was perhaps a skill of bringing all
Yes,
of them
I mean,
together.
remember that he brought together, he probably, I don't know,
Well, let's redirect that question. Is it justified that he and Jungner, after 40 years, get the credits for this work?
remember there was first of all the US Commission,
Yes.
then there was McEwen, then there was Wilson and Jungner, then the National Screening, and so on.
They were a third in line, in a way.
But the only ones that are ever mentioned in neonatal screening circles are
Oh, really?
That may be, yes.
and the
even
view
today.
is of these more recent versions is that they are derived.
Of
From
course,
those.
of course.
Oh, and believe me that in 1994 we had kind of a similar paper in the Netherlands, published by the Health Council, which is kind of the same. It's a renewal of the Wilson and Jungner criteria.
Yes, I mean, that's why they're all... have you seen this? You probably haven't.
No.
You can have this, it's a reprint of an article I wrote. I think I have another copy somewhere. That gives you some of the history of the development of screening.
Ah.
It's also in
I know that one, the one of Raffel
then
and,
there
and
is
Gray,
this,
but
this book.
I don't know this one. This is
That's
This
my
is
second. This
Walter
is the
and
second
Susie.
edition of that.
Right. Sorry, this is the same book as that.
It's not the same. That's
the second
10 years,
edition.
10, 20 years later, 30
Right.
years later.
Right.
That was published in 90 something or other, after I retired.
Right.
This one was published in 1978, 79, 1990.
Right. It's
Okay.
2009.
And that,
Periodic health examination. Should be extra busy. Oh gosh, these this abbreviation PHE. It's used for phenylalanine, periodic health examination, and now of course it's Public Health England.
this is the modern way of trying to
Copy, yeah.
to get a record of something very quickly. That's all. That's two.
Yes, I think You've written here, the WHO commissioned a comprehensive review of screening worldwide, which enunciated 10 common sense criteria.
This is a book by Raffel and Muir. Have you read that?
Yes. Well,
I mean,
I'm
yes.
aware of the fact that
Muir
they've written
Gray.
it. Well, Muir is of course probably a person cited most
Is
in neonatal screening because of his one very to the point citation on screening. All screening
Causes harm.
causes harm. Some causes
Ah,
good as well,
so that's
and
famous
of
in the Netherlands
those.
as well.
Oh yes,
Right.
actually I try to make that my motto on my internet
Yes.
page of my institution, but they wouldn't allow me because it was still unknown. Well, it is in neonatal screening. Obviously, this is not about Muir Gray, but still, what was his importance for screening in the UK then? Was he seems to be so
Probably not the
significant
right
from a broad perspective.
Really? That's very interesting because his name is hardly spoken anymore.
Remarkable.
He
Then
he appeared to create regional jobs of people called screening coordinators, most of who were midwives, and lots of collection of data started that hadn't been collected as much before. But a lot of those jobs have disappeared, so things have come and things have gone. That I understand are derived from his role in neonatal screening.
mm-hmm.
And that's a very good question. I shall go and have a look and a think. What
Yeah.
was his fundamental role? Because I think if you ask most people in screening labs today, they'd say, who? That's interesting.
Interesting, because
I think
also because of this book that has some.
Mm.
I mean, there's not many books I have on screening, but this one I have.
Ah.
It's very well written.
I think so too.
Yes.
It's very conceptual in a way. But having said that, and going back to the theme of the conversation, that is, what was the significance of Wilson's work after it was published?
Well, the answer is significant, because there it is, you know.
Even now, when we started discussions on how to prepare this, one thing that popped up was a paper that came out just a few months ago, which is on screening for severe combined immune deficiency. Severe combined immune deficiency disorder, which may be a candidate to take up in a neonatal screening program. At least it's a candidate in the Netherlands. And to make a point, the authors of that article took the 10 principles of Wilson and Jünger and tried to
Evaluate
indicate
each one.
that every single criteria was fulfilled. And that's almost 50 years after the criteria were published. So
You can have that. I see I've got another 2 copies.
thank you. Oh, this is really. Let's see. From what date is this?
Relatively recent.
Isn't it? 2006. Well, this is ever more proof that Wilson and Jünger's work are very significant, and